Long before movie battles, wooden horses, bronze helmets, and Achilles shouting at the walls, there was a broken clay tablet. No dramatic duel, no singing poet, no beautiful Helen looking down from a tower, just clay, wedge marks, a royal name. A broken Hittite tablet names Alaksandu of Wilusa, and if Wilusa is the place many scholars identify with Troy, that one name pulls the Troy tradition closer to history. But it does not give us Achilles. It gives us a real city, a treaty, and a harder question. Was the Trojan War a real historical event, or a poetic memory built from real places, real pressures, and later storytelling? This is Stickmin history. And today we are not asking whether Homer was simply true or simply fake. We are following three clues: the Alaksandu tablet, the Hisarlik mound, and the Troy 7a fire layer. Because the first clue is not a hero, it is a broken treaty tablet. Okay, so if Wilusa might be Troy, where do we put it on the ground? The place most people point to is Hisarlik, a mound in modern Turkey near the Dardanelles. And that location matters because the Dardanelles are a threshold, not a random hill. A choke point where movement, trade, and trouble can pile up. At Hisarlik, Bronze Age Troy develops through multiple settlement layers from around 3000 to 1100 BCE. And in the Bronze Age, the shoreline and river plain likely looked different from today. So this mound sat closer to movement by water. That word matters. Layers. Because every answer depends on which Troy you are standing in. In 1998, Troy was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, not because the Iliad became a newspaper report, but because the site itself is historically important. So Troy is no longer a fantasy city. But it is still not Homer's script, and that brings us to the first big trap in the Troy story. Back at the mound, the modern story gets loud in 1870. Heinrich Schliemann begins excavating at Troy, uncovers treasure, and connects it to Priam, the legendary king from Homer. And honestly, you can see why people wanted that to be true. Gold feels like proof. A famous name feels like proof. But wait. Schliemann had dug into Troy too, and Troy too was far too early for a plausible Homeric background. So the treasure made Troy famous, but it did not prove Priam's Troy. And here the names start getting slippery. Wilusa is often linked with Greek Wilios or Ilios, while Troy or Troia belongs to a related regional tradition. Together these names may converge on the same historical landscape. That is why the Alaksandu tablet is powerful, but dangerous if we ask too much from it. It gives us a name in the diplomatic world of Hatti, around 1300 BCE, when Muwatalli II makes a treaty with Alaksandu of Wilusa. That same Alaksandu tablet brings Troy closer to history, but it also draws a line. If Wilusa was real and Troy burned, why can't we just call it the Trojan War? Because the evidence proves a setting more easily than it proves a story. We will come back to that when the fire layer shows up. Down on the plain below Hisarlik, the Troy question gets bigger than a royal citadel. For a long time, it was easy to imagine Troy as a small fortress with a giant poem attached. But surveys point to a much larger settlement footprint, including a roughly 30-hectare lower city. Wait, what? That means the city in the debate is not just a little tower on a hill. Some reconstructions include a defensive ditch around parts of that lower city, which matters because boundaries tell us where people expected pressure. It is a layered settlement beside a threshold, with homes, storage, movement, and reasons for outsiders to care. And once you see that, the Dardanelles stop being scenery. They become part of the mechanism. Ships, goods, allies, enemies, and rumors move through narrow places. So a city near that threshold could become valuable, tense, and memorable. Remember the screen we opened with? One treaty tablet, one name, one city pulled toward history. The lower city adds something different. It shows why that name might have mattered to kings, traders, and neighbors. Back to the Hisarlik mound, because the layer question now gets sharper. If Troy 2 is too early, the better candidates sit later, Troy 6 and Troy 7a. These layers line up more closely with Mycenaean contact and the kind of late Bronze Age world that later epic memory could preserve. By the middle, Troy is no longer a fantasy city, but it is still not Homer's script. So the next question is physical. What actually happened to those late Bronze Age layers? Inside the late Bronze Age mound, the story splits into two scars. At Troy 6, the destruction looks dramatic, but not necessarily like a sack. Troy 6, probably destroyed sometime in the 13th century BCE, is often interpreted as having suffered earthquake damage, though the exact cause and date remain debated. That matters because one destruction layer does not solve the whole question. A city can fall from earth, fire, attackers, neglect, or some messy combination. Then comes Troy 7a, usually placed in the later 13th to early 12th century BCE, with its destruction often dated around 1180 BCE, and here the picture feels different. The city is densely rebuilt with cramped spaces and storage jars sunk into floors. That is not just background decoration. It suggests people were living tightly, storing supplies, and dealing with stress inside the city. And that is where archaeology gets interesting, because daily objects can preserve crisis better than royal legends do. There is fire damage. There are bones and sling bullets discussed as possible signs of violence. And that is the strongest physical clue for a remembered violent ending. But strongest does not mean final. Remember the delayed question? If VIIa was real and Troy burned, why can't we just call it the Trojan War? Because Homer gives us named heroes, motives, speeches, gods, and a 10-year siege. Archaeology gives us walls, layers, fire, storage, bones, sling bullets, and diplomatic names. Those are not the same kind of proof. Back to the Alaksandu tablet because it does one thing extremely well. It places VIIa inside the real diplomatic world of Hatti. And Hittite records mention tensions involving Western Anatolia and a power often called Ahiawa, which many connect with the Mycenaean Greek world. That sounds incredibly close to the Trojan War, but close is not the same as confirmed. The records suggest a world where conflict around Troy-like places makes sense. They do not hand us Hector at the gate. So here is the honest rest-itch. Hisarlik gives us the place. VIIa gives us the diplomatic name, Troy 7. Gives us a possible crisis or conflict layer that later memory may have transformed into epic, and together they point to memory, not certainty. Troy was real. Homer's exact story remains unproven. That is not a disappointing answer. It is more interesting. Because epic poetry may preserve pressure from a real Bronze Age world even when it reshapes that world into heroes and songs. So back to the object we started with, the Alaksandu tablet. The Alaksandu tablet does not hand us Achilles, but it does hand us a real Bronze Age world where a Troy-like memory could begin. This raises a harder question. When a poem remembers a real place, how much history can survive inside the story? Or put another way, when later poets inherit a real city, where does history end and epic begin? The mound gives us layers. The tablet gives us names. The Dardanelles give us thresholds. And the Troy 7a fire layer gives us a scar that later memory may have carried forward. We follow the objects, the sites, and the systems that turn old stories into testable history. Do you think the strongest clue is the Alaksandu tablet, the lower city, or the Troy 7a fire layer? See you next time.